Welcome back, and we're moving into our second conversation for today as we focus on the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, also known as the UNCAC. We have with us two representatives from the United Nations Development Program. We have Elishah St. Luce, who is the Program Associate for the Democratic Governance and Poverty Reduction. And we also have with us Karen Bernard, who is the Deputy Resident Representative for UNDP. Good morning, ladies, and welcome.
Good morning. Thanks for having us. Good morning.
And we must note that there was a scheduling error, so we do not have the representatives of the Attorney General with us, but we will, of course, continue with what is a partnership between the Attorney General Ministry and the United Nations Development Program. So let's set the backdrop for the UNCAC itself, which is a UN convention, and talk about when it was established and what it signifies for Belize to now be a signatory. Let's have that, Karen.
Yes, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, as with all UN conventions and treaties, was established by the General Assembly by the membership of all of the countries that belong to the United Nations, including, of course, Belize. The year it was established, Elishah will have to help me, I can't recall the year, but at this point, Belize is the 184th country to sign on to the UNCAC. And it's quite important for any country as a governance issue, as part of your nation building process. Belize is quite a young country, having gained its independence in 1981. So this is exciting for us to be able to support from United Nations this process in which, as you said, it's a partnership, but the government is leading, of course. And we're here to support and to bring in all of our expertise and the resources that we can make available to do that.
Yeah. Putting into context the work that UNDP does do in a country where it works, there is a heavy emphasis on governance projects done in conjunction with NGOs and also with government entities. How will being a signatory to the UNCAC and the rollout amplify that type of work?
Okay, so in terms of the UNCAC and its significance in terms of improving governance nationally, what we now have is an international framework that sets the stage in terms of how or what good governance looks like. And so it does support the programming work of UNDP in terms of grounding us in, now that we have a government that has ratified or signed on, acceded to the convention, we have certain next steps that we can work to. It's not that we're doing standalone initiatives, but we're looking holistically at the governance landscape that is supported by the UNCAC, and looking at how this governance landscape and the framework or the recommendations for the framework will be rolled out nationally. And so as a result, it supports a more systematic programming of our work at UNDP in supporting not just the government, but also our partners in civil society. And also in terms of your previous question, the convention is a fairly new convention. The convention was adopted by the General Assembly in 2003. And in 2005, the convention was signed by approximately 64 countries in Merida, Mexico. So it's a relatively young convention, 12 years old, as a UN convention.
From a layman's point of view, the everyday person, what is the importance of the UNCAC, and what are the benefits that Belize would gain having signed on to this particular convention?
I would say it's very significant for people in Belize. In fact, it's one of the areas that I've heard so many comments on and so much interest in from people from all walks of life. The issue of corruption. This is an issue which has come into the public debate over the last year since I've been in the country. And so I would say that there's a great importance in how this will assist the country, is that the UNCAC provides a framework in which, when a country wishes to tackle the corruption issues, which the government here has decided to do in Belize, everyone is very interested in this process, and it's necessary at this point in time, I think. So the UNCAC provides a framework which will guide you through that process and will give you specific areas you can work on. And it's a path that has been walked down by more than 180 countries so far. Lessons have been learned. there are ways to do this. Some of it is very technical. So, for example, there will be need to develop legislation and processes for asset recovery, processes such as, for example, witness protection. I know that the Solicitor General is quite keen to acquire that expertise. Some of it is legal, but in the end, this convention will help to guide the country towards a better governance, a Belize which is a better place to live for all the citizens.
Yeah. Now, the country can vividly recall the significant step that was made and the process that it took to be able to get the UNCAC signed. So I think the first question that a lot of people ask is, what now? You know, and the fear many times with convention is you can always raise that flag and say, I signed it, but you want to see the action to follow. And so that is the process that you're embarking on in conjunction with the Attorney General's ministry at this point.
So I think since the country acceded to the UNCAC in December of last year, we've seen a lot of steps being made by the government with the Attorney General Ministry as the focal point for the convention in terms of the actual implementation of the convention. Now, the convention has certain necessary steps that a country has to go through after it has acceded. The first step would be to identify the national focal point, in this case, the Attorney General. Following that, the country then has to look at its existing systems, legislation, policies, programs, and bodies in order to determine where the gaps are and what needs to be improved. That's where we are as a country in terms of our partnership with the Attorney General's ministry. That's where we are, looking at a compilation of the existing legislation that we have in place as a country, and then assessing the legislation in order to ensure that the country has all the requirements of the UNCAC, but also to ensure that in terms of the bodies, the policies that are in place currently, that they're performing optimally based on the recommendations of the UNCAC. And then, of course, ultimately, these technical, legislative necessities of the convention would ultimately lead to an improved process of governance, which then translates to the regular person on the ground in terms of what we know as a culture of either accepting or not accepting corruption, in terms of what we, the people on the ground, hold our representatives, the private sector, accountable for. But it starts with the assessment.
Yeah, you have to know what you have. It's
exactly.
like your baseline. So, and I think, Karen, you mentioned such a critical point, because when you talk about legislative changes, you know, people see, and I think are now at a point where they can be able to recognize what is that considered an act of corruption. And many times, perhaps there are not legal processes in place or protocols in place, or there were loopholes that were used to be able to get what has taken place. But looking at the system as it is now, the hope is to be able to enforce the legislation, to be able to address any issue that is deemed an act of corruption. Is that right?
That's part of the process, because there's also, as you pointed out, education and awareness around issues such as what is corruption and what is not corruption.
Yeah.
Corruption is an issue that's present in every country. Belize has now decided to really tackle that. So the convention helps to operationalize this and, as you said, close the loopholes. Also to enable certain actions that can be taken and learn from how other countries have been able to manage and reduce the level of corruption. So I think that's part of the whole process that the country has now embarked on. But there's also, in the United Nations system, UNDP is working with the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, which is the UN agency specializing in this area and which holds the secretariat. So they have a monitoring function, and there's other countries also involved. So Belize is not on its own. This will be monitored, reported on, followed up on, and so UNDP is also bringing in UNODC, which doesn't have an office in country, but we do. We have a whole team here. And they will bring experts in, for example, this week and as needed.
Yeah.
So that's part of the whole process.
There's been this argument, if I may, where some people put forward that, okay, So there is the UNCAC, and it primarily deals with the government of Belize in this case. But they're also putting forward that corruption exists outside of the government as well. Does the scope of UNCAC include corruption in the private sector, for argument's sake?
Yes, it does. The UNCAC, and that's often a misconception that the UNCAC is only tailored to, or the UNCAC only holds the government accountable, and that is not the case. The UNCAC is an international framework that holds both the government, public sector, and private sector accountable. Now, when we look at Chapter 3 of the Convention, which then speaks of the major crimes that are categorized as corruption, you have a categorization of crimes that relates to the public sector, but also as it relates to the private sector. So the UNCAC holds the private sector as accountable as it does the public sector, because there is a recognition that, of course, that corruption has a trickle-down effect, but that also the public sector is not the only guilty party as it relates to corrupt practices and corrupt acts. So it holds both private and public sectors accountable.
Absolutely. Now, let's talk to us about what's going to take place this week. So it's training and self-assessment that will be taking place in one.
Right. It's the commencement of the self-assessment process. Now, like I said, the self-assessment is a mandatory step as it relates to the convention. This allows the government or the country to report in the conference of the state parties through the implementation review mechanism. Now, it's all technical, yes. It's all technical, but essentially what the country has to do is look at the existing systems that are in place. As I said, the legislation that is in place, the different bodies that we have set up based on the different chapters of the convention. So essentially this week we have our partner UN agency, our UN sister, UNODC. The legal expert is coming into country. And from tomorrow and Thursday, we're going to be looking at, firstly, the basic definition of corruption. What is corruption? We have a cross-section of partners from both civil society and the government who are coming together to discuss what is corruption, what is the UNCAC, what are the requirements of the UNCAC, and then moving on, looking at the requirements of the self-assessment. So this week, after we've at least come to a common understanding as a group, as a core group of both government and non-governmental organizations, the intent is to then start looking at the country's self-assessment checklist. And so on Thursday, we're going to look at the existing legislation that the country has and answer certain questions as it relates to where the country is. And this would help to create the assessment, which would then give us a determination of the gaps that exist and what the country needs to do, how the institutions would be shaped, and then also provide the country the space to be reviewed by peers.
So it's taking stock, it's deciding what will be the definitions used, and then taking stock. And I would imagine it would be a great way to decide what the priority areas will be from there. So if the first step, which a lot of people might get excited about, is recovery asset and putting things in place for recovery assets, is the first priority, then perhaps that would be one way to go. But there are multiple areas that will need to be addressed.
Definitely.
Now, looking at it from the partnership that is established, and I hear you speaking about bringing in technical expertise, and obviously having had exposure in other countries as well, it's a great way to share good practices. How does the partnership work between the AG Ministry and the UNDP?
Well, I would say that the partnership in Belize it emerged organically, that different partners, different players in the country decided that they were going to take on this issue. So that partnership established itself. And it's a partnership between civil society and government. I think we all know who has been working on this campaign, getting the issue out there, getting the discussion going. And it's actually a very broad partnership, and I've seen a very a vibrant democratic process in Belize while this is taking place. And the media has also had an important role in, in bringing that debate to the public and getting the issues out there and raising the concerns. So I would say it's a very vibrant partnership in which UNDP, we almost came to this towards the end or after the partnership was established, and we were requested to support, to provide some technical assistance, which of course is the reason why the United Nations exists. That's what we're here to do. Yeah. So we were happy to step in and join, as I said, probably the last people joining that partnership. So that's been now captured under project, in which we have some funding available, modest amount, to undertake certain activities. So as I said, we have the training. Some of that is more technical legal. We have also, there's a communications strategy that will be developed. So that's really how the partnership is working at the moment.
Yeah. Now, the self-assessment, and it's, when we think of a self-assessment, I'm trying to make sure people at home will really understand this. If I do a self-assessment, it means I'm judging what I think I'm good at, what I'm not good at, and we may be honest, but obviously it's great to have a checks and balances in place, your monitoring and evaluation. So what I heard you speak about is that even after the process of the training and the self-assessment, there is another assessment that will take place, right?
It's more of a continuation of the assessment. So we can't complete the self-assessment in one day. Yeah. You're looking at existing legislation, which is a lot. Yeah. You're looking at existing bodies, and you're looking at the provisions of the convention. But in terms of the checks and balances, what helps to keep the process transparent and honest is that we have key partners from civil society who are overseeing, validating. But in addition, there is the convention has its own governance structure mechanism that helps to keep the countries honest. So in terms of the internal review group, the country will have to be peer reviewed or reviewed by two of its peers, one country from the region, one country outside of the region. And so, of course, the feedback from the self-assessment will have to be validated locally as well as internationally. And so that helps to keep the process on track. But this week, it's definitely just a start, not the finalization.
Let's go back a bit. When I look at what has happened in terms of the events over the past 6 months, let's say, there was a push from the unions, particularly the Belize National Teachers Union, for the government of Belize to sign on to the UNCAC. This was during an 11-day period during which there was industrial action. That has taken place. The government has signed, and we're all on board at this point. Now there's the private sector, the business community. The Chamber of Commerce is also pushing this agenda heavily to try to get the government to kind of conform with what is presented within the UNCAC, the provisions and what have you. Do you think that there is a balance, so to speak, in terms of the private sector pushing the UNCAC agenda and the government also pushing the UNCAC agenda for the private sector to also fall within conformity of the convention?
Is there a balance?
Yeah. It seems, from my end, it would seem as if though the private sector is pushing more for the government to comply, as opposed to the government also pushing for the private sector to comply.
If I may say a word about this also, it's we're speaking about corruption which can happen in the private sector and in the government, but we also have the issue of interactions between the private sector and the government. You may be following the case in Brazil with the big construction company Odebrecht, which is of course private sector, but the issue is that they've been apparently taking kickbacks, or I'm not sure the exact word for it, from governments of a number of countries. So the private sector and the government do not really operate separately, but I would say it's part of all of Belizean society. And since the more confrontational moments of what occurred in the last 6 months, There have also been other activities that different social partners have been organizing. We had the debates organized by Social Security Board in which school students were putting forth their arguments for and against UNCAC. So that was quite wonderful to see. There was also, for example, the Bar Association had some training on that, and that's the association in which all the lawyers in the country are members. So I feel that the process has been really ongoing, and UNDP, we've been more behind the scenes for the most part, but we have been working towards, for example, getting everything ready to have this training this week and have the expert come in country.
Now, at what point in time will there be public feedback into the system?
Public feedback. Well, the convention also mandates that there is certain level of publicity that has to be given. For example, once the gap analysis is concluded or the self-assessment is concluded, at least the executive summary has to be made public. But in terms of the partnership that the UNDP, UNODC has with the Attorney General's ministry, there is the recognition that the public has to be kept informed. Again, there might be an assumption that things are not being done, but things are moving. But the public, if the public is not aware, there is, again, the assumption is that nothing is happening. And so one of the key elements or components of that partnership is ensuring that the public is kept abreast. This being one of the starting points, that whenever we're undertaking major steps or milestones as it relates to the convention, the public would be made aware. But also, as we said, many times governments are not opened to have civil society partner and be closely accompany the process of self-assessment, validation, UNCAC, whatever. Although the UNCAC calls for it, in this instance, in the case of Belize, we see this close collaboration and partnership through the project where we have the partnership with the Attorney General's ministry. We have a wide cross-section and representation that oversees the implementation of the UNCAC. So we do have the Belize Chamber of Industry and Commerce, for example, represented. The unions are represented, the National Youth Council, so the NGO network. So we have this accompanying process, working alongside with the government and UNDP in ensuring that implementation is meaningful.
All right. And anything else that you'd like people to know as we embark on this particular project at this time?
Well, I guess you can look out for, anticipate that you will have more interaction between us, the Attorney General's ministry, and the public, as much as possible, keeping the public informed of what is going on as it relates to the convention. But also with the understanding that it is not to be expected that we will see quick wins necessarily, because corruption is a culture that takes time to change. But with the hope that as time progresses, as if the implementation is true, that we will see a cultural shift over time.
Okay. Anything?
Yes, I would just like to say I think it's an exciting moment in the history of Belize, and from United Nations we're pleased to be able to share in that moment and support in any way we can.
All right. Well, thank you, ladies, for stopping in and keeping us updated.
Thank you for having us.
We're going to go ahead and take a break, and when we come back, we're going to be focusing on cancer awareness activities taking place this month, so stay tuned.